Number 1. Bill Cosby. For decades, Bill Cosby was one of the most recognizable figures in American entertainment. To many, he was a symbol of warmth and fatherly wisdom, best known as America's Dad from his role on The Cosby Show. Families gathered around the television in the 1980s to watch his sitcom, which portrayed an idealized image of an upper-middle-class African-American family. Beyond acting, Cosby also worked in stand-up comedy, wrote books, and hosted family-friendly programs like Kids Say the Darndest Things. His influence stretched across generations, shaping comedy and television while cementing his reputation as a trusted, wholesome figure. But beneath that carefully crafted public image, troubling allegations had been surfacing for years. Rumors followed him throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, with women coming forward to claim that Cosby had taken advantage of them. Most of these claims initially faded into the background, dismissed in part because of his celebrity status and the immense cultural capital he had built. Yet one case would change everything and ultimately bring the man once adored by millions into a courtroom where his reputation could no longer shield him. In 2004, Andrea Constand, a former employee of Temple University, accused Cosby of drugging and violating her at his home. At the time, prosecutors declined to bring charges, citing insufficient evidence. Constand later pursued a civil lawsuit, and in 2006 she received a settlement. For a while, it seemed like that chapter might remain buried, but the story did not end there. In the years that followed, dozens of other women came forward with strikingly similar accusations, creating a wave of pressure that could no longer be ignored. By 2015, the case against Cosby had reignited when newly unsealed court documents revealed his own admission in a deposition. He had acknowledged obtaining sedatives with the intent of giving them to women he wanted to be with. This revelation was a turning point. The Montgomery County District Attorney's Office reopened the investigation, and Cosby was formally charged with aggravated indecent assault against Constand. It was a dramatic fall from grace for a man who had once stood as one of the most respected entertainers in the world. The trial began in 2017, drawing international attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, supporters, and critics alike, all watching as prosecutors laid out their case. Constand testified, while other women were permitted to share their accounts to show a pattern of behavior. Cosby's defense team pushed back, portraying the interactions as consensual and attacking the credibility of the accusations. The jury deliberated for days, but the first trial ended in a deadlock with no verdict reached. A retrial was quickly scheduled, and in April 2018, the outcome was very different. This time, the prosecution presented additional testimony from several women, strengthening their case. The jury found Cosby guilty of 3 counts of aggravated indecent assault. It was a stunning verdict. After decades of admiration and influence, Cosby was now a convicted felon. In September of that year, the judge sentenced him to 3 to 10 years in state prison. At 81 years old, Cosby was immediately taken into custody. Adding to the weight of the sentence, he was officially declared a violent predator, a designation that required him to undergo lifetime counseling and register with state police. The ruling marked the first high-profile conviction of the Me Too era, making Cosby a symbol of accountability in a changing cultural landscape. Inside prison, Cosby was placed in general population, though his celebrity status meant his incarceration remained under heavy media scrutiny. He served just under 3 years before a dramatic legal reversal altered the course of his case once again. In June 2021, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court overturned his conviction, not because of new evidence, but due to a due process violation. Years earlier, a prosecutor had promised not to pursue charges in the Constand case, a deal that had allowed Cosby to testify freely in the civil proceedings. The court ruled that this promise should have been honored, and therefore, his conviction was invalid. Cosby was released that very day, walking free after nearly 3 years behind bars. The decision ignited heated debate. Supporters argued that the legal system had to follow its own rules, regardless of public opinion. Critics, however, saw the release as a devastating blow to the women who had come forward, and a setback in the broader movement for accountability. Today, Bill Cosby's legacy is forever tainted. Once praised as a pioneer in television, a philanthropist, and a groundbreaking entertainer, his name is now inseparable from scandal. The sheer volume of accusations, coupled with his conviction and release, have left the public divided. While the law set him free, the court of public opinion has largely turned against him. The rise and fall of Bill Cosby remains one of the most striking examples of how power and celebrity can mask darker truths, and how justice, even when achieved, can still leave lasting questions. His story continues to be discussed not only as a case of criminal justice, but as a cultural reckoning, one that reshaped how society views the responsibilities of fame and the importance of believing survivors. Number 2. Jimmy Savile. For decades, Jimmy Savile was one of the most recognizable faces on British television. With his eccentric outfits, trademark cigar, and larger-than-life personality, he became a household name as the host of Top of the Pops, and later Jim'll Fix It. For many in the UK, he was seen as a quirky entertainer who could make children's dreams come true on Saturday nights. He mingled with royalty, politicians, and celebrities, raising millions for charities and hospitals. To the public, Savile was not only a star, but also a philanthropist, an untouchable figure in British pop culture. But after his death in 2011, a horrifying truth emerged. Savile had spent decades hiding behind his fame, using his access to commit crimes on a scale that stunned the nation. In the years immediately following his passing, a growing number of allegations surfaced. Women and men came forward to describe how they had been targeted by Savile when they were children or vulnerable young adults. At first, the sheer number of accusations seemed almost impossible to comprehend, but as investigations deepened, the reality became undeniable. In 2012, the ITV documentary Exposure, The Other Side of Jimmy Savile, brought the first wave of victims' accounts to a wide audience, triggering one of the largest criminal investigations in British history into a single individual. Operation Yewtree, launched by London's Metropolitan Police, gathered testimony from across the UK. The findings were staggering. Investigators concluded that Savile had abused hundreds of people over more than 40 years, with victims ranging from young children to hospital patients. Many of these crimes occurred in institutions where Savile had been welcomed as a celebrity fundraiser: schools, children's homes, and even hospitals. His fame had allowed him access, and his reputation had shielded him from scrutiny. The report published by police and the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children in 2013 laid bare the scale. More than 400 people came forward, with ages ranging from as young as 8 to adults in their 30s. The abuse spanned the 1960s through the 2000s. Investigators called him a predatory offender who manipulated his way into positions of trust. The sheer breadth of his offending and the fact that it had remained hidden for so long left the British public reeling. What made Savile's case even more disturbing was how he managed to avoid exposure during his lifetime. Rumors had circulated in the entertainment industry, and there had even been whispers in the press, but none of it ever reached the courts while he was alive. His charity work and connections to powerful figures, including friendships with politicians and even visits with members of the royal family, gave him an aura of untouchability. For decades, complaints were dismissed or ignored, allowing him to continue unchecked. The public reaction after the truth came out was one of shock, anger, and betrayal. Institutions that had once proudly associated themselves with Savile scrambled to remove his name from plaques and buildings. Hospitals returned donations, and organizations issued apologies to victims. The BBC, where Savile had worked for decades, faced fierce criticism for having ignored warning signs. The scandal forced a nationwide reckoning about celebrity culture, institutional failures, and how predators can exploit trust to evade accountability. Savile's legacy today is not that of the flamboyant entertainer once adored by millions, but of one of Britain's most prolific offenders, hidden in plain sight for over 4 decades. His story remains one of the darkest chapters in television history, a reminder of how fame and influence can be weaponized to protect even the most heinous behavior. For survivors, the truth came too late for justice against the man himself. But the exposure of his crimes has changed how institutions handle allegations of abuse, ensuring that silence like this will never be allowed again. Number 3. Marv Albert. In the 1990s, few voices in sports were as instantly recognizable as Marv Albert. Known as the voice of basketball, his booming "yes" call echoed through NBA broadcasts on NBC and became synonymous with some of the league's biggest moments. He was a trusted figure in living rooms across America, bringing not just basketball, but also football, hockey, and even boxing into homes with authority and energy. For decades, Albert stood as one of the premier broadcasters in sports, a man whose presence on television lent legitimacy to the games themselves. But in 1997, his celebrated career was derailed when his name became attached to a scandal so shocking that it dominated headlines for months and left his professional future hanging by a thread. The controversy began with allegations made by a woman who claimed Albert assaulted her in a hotel room in Virginia. The accusations described not only physical violence, but also disturbing details that contrasted sharply with Albert's wholesome television persona. By the summer of 1997, the respected broadcaster found himself indicted on felony charges, including forcible sodomy. The gravity of the allegations stunned the sports world. Fans who associated Albert with thrilling playoff moments suddenly saw his name tied to police reports and courtroom testimony. As the trial got underway in September of that year, the details presented were deeply embarrassing for Albert. Witness testimony described him biting the woman multiple times during the encounter, leaving clear marks. Prosecutors built a case that suggested Albert had gone far beyond the bounds of acceptable conduct, framing the incident as violent and intentional. The defense, meanwhile, worked to undermine the accuser's credibility, pointing to inconsistencies in her account. But the trial quickly turned into a spectacle, with salacious revelations about Albert's private life making headlines nationwide. For a man whose reputation had been built on professionalism and polish, the courtroom disclosures were devastating. Halfway through the proceedings, Albert and his legal team made a pivotal decision. Rather than risk a felony conviction, he agreed to a plea deal. On September 25, 1997, Albert pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of misdemeanor assault and battery. In exchange, prosecutors dropped the more serious felony count. The plea meant Albert avoided the possibility of jail time, though he faced up to 1 year behind bars if he violated the conditions of his sentence. The punishment handed down was a suspended 12-month sentence and 1 year of probation, contingent on Albert staying out of further legal trouble. While the outcome spared him prison, the damage to his career was immediate. That same day, NBC announced it was terminating its relationship with him. The network released a statement citing his guilty plea and declaring its partnership with the broadcaster was over. For someone who had been a fixture on national broadcasts, the firing was a public and humiliating fall. The scandal dominated sports pages and mainstream news outlets alike. It wasn't just the legal case that captured attention, but also the sheer incongruity of the details. Marv Albert, the trusted and buttoned-up commentator, now at the center of a lurid trial. His firing from NBC removed him from the national spotlight, and many wondered if he would ever return to broadcasting. For nearly 2 years, Albert's career was in limbo. Yet remarkably, Albert found a path back. By 1999, he was given a second chance, returning to the broadcast booth with the New York Knicks on the MSG network. Slowly, he began to rebuild his reputation. Though he never entirely escaped the shadow of the 1997 scandal, his talent as a broadcaster allowed him to re-establish himself in the industry. Over time, networks like TNT brought him back for NBA coverage, and fans once again heard his signature voice calling the game's biggest plays. While he no longer held the same untouchable stature as before, Albert managed to carve out a career resurgence that lasted into the 2000s. Still, the 1997 case remains a permanent part of his legacy. It marked one of the first times a major sports media personality faced such intense public scrutiny over criminal allegations. The combination of courtroom drama, celebrity status, and sensational details ensured the story would live on long after the trial ended. For Marv Albert, the episode represented a striking contrast. A man whose professional life was built on clear calls and steady authority, undone by a private scandal that revealed a very different side of his life. Today, Albert is remembered as both one of the greatest voices in sports broadcasting and as the subject of one of the most shocking legal scandals ever to hit the industry. His case highlights how quickly fame and trust can unravel when private misconduct becomes public record, and how even the most iconic figures are not immune to consequences. Number 4. Todd and Julie Chrisley. For years, Todd and Julie Chrisley sold audiences the dream of a picture-perfect Southern family. Their hit reality show, Chrisley Knows Best, premiered on USA Network in 2014 and quickly became a staple of mid-2010s television. Viewers tuned in to watch the flashy patriarch, Todd, banter with his wife Julie, raise their children in luxury, and flaunt the trappings of a lifestyle that looked effortless. To fans, they were entertaining, glamorous, and aspirational, the very definition of reality TV success. But behind the carefully staged scenes, the Chrisleys were hiding a very different reality. What looked like wealth and stability on screen was being propped up by fraud, deception, and years of unpaid taxes. Long before their show ever aired, financial cracks had begun to appear. In the early 2000s, Todd filed for bankruptcy, leaving behind millions in unpaid debt. Prosecutors would later reveal that instead of learning from that collapse, the couple doubled down. Todd and Julie allegedly conspired to falsify financial documents, making their net worth appear far higher than it really was. They submitted fake bank statements, forged credit reports, and inflated income figures to secure loans worth tens of millions of dollars. Those funds were then used to bankroll their lavish lifestyle. Luxury cars, sprawling homes, designer clothes, and the polished image that became the backdrop for their television empire. At the same time, the Chrisleys were accused of evading the IRS. For years, prosecutors said they hid millions in income while continuing to live extravagantly. Even as Chrisley Knows Best became a rating success, Todd and Julie were allegedly funneling money through shell companies and keeping the government at bay with false filings. Their television fame only seemed to embolden the illusion. Fans saw an over-the-top family living in wealth and comfort. But behind the scenes, investigators were piecing together a trail of deception that told a much darker story. In August 2019, federal prosecutors unsealed indictments against both Todd and Julie. The charges were sweeping: tax evasion, bank fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The indictments alleged that for years, the couple had orchestrated a scheme to defraud banks out of more than $30 million, and that they had deliberately concealed income from their hit show. For the millions of viewers who had tuned in to watch their Southern charm and family antics, the allegations were almost impossible to reconcile. Their trial began in 2022 in Atlanta, and the proceedings were as dramatic as anything shown on their series. Prosecutors presented emails, forged documents, and testimony from former employees who described how the couple directed them to falsify records. They argued that the Chrisleys lived a lifestyle of excess while deliberately shirking their legal responsibilities. The defense painted a different picture, insisting that the couple were victims of a disloyal former business partner and claiming the government was unfairly targeting them because of their celebrity. But after weeks of evidence and testimony, the jury delivered a clear verdict: guilty on all major counts. The sentencing in November 2022 was a crushing blow. Todd Chrisley received 12 years in federal prison and 16 months of probation, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for crimes of this type. Julie Chrisley, at age 50, was sentenced to 7 years in prison and 16 months of probation. The court emphasized that the Chrisleys had not only defrauded banks and hidden income, but had also failed to show genuine remorse, continuing to present themselves as innocent, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. In January 2023, the couple reported to prison to begin serving their sentences. Todd was assigned to the federal prison camp in Pensacola, Florida, while Julie entered the Federal Medical Center in Lexington, Kentucky. For the first time in nearly a decade, the Chrisley story was not playing out on reality television, but in the stark environment of federal custody. Their absence left Chrisley Knows Best effectively finished, its stars now confined by prison rules instead of television scripts. The downfall of Todd and Julie Chrisley was one of the most stunning in reality television history. Unlike scripted scandals or tabloid gossip, this was a federal conviction backed by hard evidence and lengthy prison terms. Fans who had watched them for years were left to reconcile the cheerful, wisecracking family they saw on screen with the court documents that revealed years of fraud. Their case also stood out because it wasn't just one star of the show. It was both husband and wife, a united front in both their fame and their crimes, now facing years of separation in prison. Yet even after their sentencing, the Chrisleys' saga continues to spark debate. Some fans hold out hope that appeals might shorten their time behind bars, while others see their case as a cautionary tale about the dangers of image-driven wealth. What is clear is that the Chrisleys built an empire on illusion, and when the truth came out, the consequences were severe. For a family that once invited millions of viewers into their glamorous world, Todd and Julie Chrisley now serve as an unforgettable reminder of how quickly fame can crumble when it rests on fraud. Their names, once synonymous with reality TV success, are now tied forever to one of the most dramatic financial scandals in American entertainment. Number 5. Paula Poundstone. In the 1990s, Paula Poundstone was a familiar presence in American comedy and television. With her quick wit, self-deprecating humor, and sharp improvisational style, she stood out in a crowded field of stand-up performers. She appeared on late-night talk shows, headlined comedy specials, and became a beloved panelist on game shows like To Tell the Truth. Her voice was even recognizable to younger audiences through her work on PBS programs, where she projected a wholesome, approachable charm. To many, she embodied the quirky but lovable comic who could make any situation funny. But in 2001, Poundstone's career and personal life collided in a scandal that stunned fans, one that exposed serious failings behind the persona of a trusted entertainer. The trouble began in June 2001 when Poundstone was arrested in Santa Monica, California. Authorities alleged that she had committed multiple lewd acts against children in her care. At the time, she was both an adoptive mother and a foster parent. Alongside those charges were counts of child endangerment, including an incident where she had been caught driving intoxicated with several children in the car. For someone who had built her reputation on trustworthiness and humor, the allegations were catastrophic. The case moved quickly through the courts, and as prosecutors laid out their claims, the public was left reeling. The charges initially included several felonies, the most serious of which carried the potential for significant prison time. But as the case developed, prosecutors eventually offered a plea deal. In September 2001, Poundstone pleaded no contest to a reduced set of charges: one felony count of child abuse and one misdemeanor count of inflicting injury on a child. The lewd conduct charges were dropped entirely as part of the agreement, leaving the drunk driving and related abuse as the central elements of her conviction. The sentence spared Poundstone jail time, but it was still a heavy punishment for a public figure. She was given 5 years of probation, ordered to complete 6 months of residential alcohol treatment, and required to undergo regular counseling. On top of that, she was permanently barred from taking in any more foster children, cutting off a role she had once embraced as part of her personal life. While she avoided prison, the legal outcome still marked a major fall from grace. The media coverage was intense. Headlines focused on the shocking nature of the accusations, and the story dominated entertainment news. For fans who knew her as a witty, warm-hearted panelist and comic, the idea of her being tied to such charges was difficult to process. She withdrew from much of her public life during this period, canceling appearances and stepping back from charity work, especially those involving children. Her image as a family-friendly figure was badly damaged. In the years that followed, Poundstone worked to rebuild both her life and her career. After completing treatment and fulfilling her probation requirements, she slowly returned to stand-up comedy, leaning into the craft that had made her famous in the first place. She also spoke publicly about her struggles with alcohol, framing her experience as a cautionary tale about the consequences of addiction. While she eventually found a measure of professional redemption, performing again on stage and contributing to radio and television, the case never fully disappeared from her public identity. The scandal left a permanent mark. For many, Paula Poundstone would never again be just a quick-witted comic they remembered from the 1990s. Instead, her name became linked with one of the more troubling legal cases involving a comedian in modern entertainment history. Though she managed to resume her career, the dark cloud of 2001 remains a part of her legacy, a reminder of how personal struggles can spill into public life with devastating consequences. Number 6. Josh Duggar. For years, Josh Duggar was the golden child of one of America's most famous reality television families. As the eldest son featured on TLC's 19 Kids and Counting, Josh was positioned as a role model in a household that promoted strict religious values and a conservative lifestyle. Millions of viewers tuned in to watch the Duggar family navigate life with an enormous brood of children. And Josh often stood front and center, presenting himself as a faithful husband, devoted father, and advocate for the very morals the show claimed to uphold. To fans, he appeared to embody discipline, integrity, and traditional family strength. But what lay behind the cameras was far more troubling. Over time, revelations about his behavior shattered the family's carefully cultivated public image, and Josh Duggar's name would eventually become synonymous with one of the most shocking scandals to ever touch reality television. The first cracks in Josh's image appeared in 2015 when an old police report resurfaced. It revealed that, as a teenager, Duggar had inappropriately touched multiple underage girls, including some of his own sisters. Though no charges were filed due to the statute of limitations, the information sent shockwaves through the public. TLC responded by immediately canceling 19 Kids and Counting, cutting short what had been one of its flagship programs. For fans who had trusted the Duggars as an example of faith-based living, the revelations created a staggering sense of betrayal. Josh publicly admitted to what he described as inexcusable conduct, but even as his reputation was collapsing, the family tried to preserve their place in the public eye. Still, Josh's credibility as a figure of moral authority was permanently damaged. After the 2015 revelations, Duggar withdrew from public life, though he remained active within his family circle. he attempted to rebuild, running a used car dealership in Arkansas and keeping largely out of the spotlight. But in 2021, his world imploded again, this time with far more serious consequences. In April of that year, federal agents arrested Josh Duggar on charges of receiving and possessing child pornography. According to investigators, a forensic search of his computer revealed he had downloaded hundreds of illegal files, some involving children under the age of 10. Federal authorities described the material as among the most disturbing they had encountered, and the charges carried the possibility of decades in prison. The case drew enormous attention, not only because of its severity, but also because of the Duggar family's public stance on morality. Josh had once been employed by the Family Research Council, a conservative political organization that promoted traditional values. Now, the contrast between his former public role and the crimes he was accused of could not have been starker. His arrest forced even longtime supporters of the Duggar family to reckon with a deeply unsettling reality, that the person they once viewed as a role model had been living a double life. Josh's trial began in November 2021, and over the course of 2 weeks, prosecutors laid out a detailed case. Forensic experts explained how his dealership computer had been used to access and store the illegal material, despite efforts to hide activity behind layers of password protection. Witnesses further recalled troubling aspects of his past, reinforcing the government's argument that the evidence fit a pattern. Duggar's defense team insisted he had been set up and suggested that others could have accessed the files, but the jury remained unconvinced. On December 9, 2021, the jury found Josh Duggar guilty on both counts, receiving and possessing child pornography. The sentencing came in May 2022. Federal Judge Timothy Brooks emphasized both the seriousness of the crimes and the harm caused by individuals who create demand for such material. Duggar was sentenced to 12 years and 7 months in federal prison, nearly 13 years, followed by 20 years of supervised release. He was also barred from unsupervised contact with minors and from accessing the internet without approval. At just 34 years old, the once promising star of 19 Kids and Counting had become a federal inmate. He was sent to FC1 Segoville in Texas, a facility known for housing offenders convicted of similar crimes. For the Duggar family, the fallout was immense. TLC cut all remaining ties, canceling spin-offs and distancing itself entirely from the once profitable brand. Former fans expressed not only outrage, but also deep disillusionment, pointing to what they saw as hypocrisy in the family's public image. The case also reignited scrutiny of how the original allegations from Josh's teenage years had been handled, and whether accountability had been avoided for too long. Today, Josh Duggar remains behind bars, serving a sentence that will keep him away from his family and the public eye for more than a decade. His case is remembered as a grim example of how public personas can mask private crimes, and how the illusion of moral authority can collapse in the face of evidence and accountability. Once introduced to America as the eldest son of a family that claimed to represent faith and integrity, Josh Duggar's legacy now stands as one of scandal, hypocrisy, and criminal conviction. Number 7. Jared Fogle. For more than a decade, Jared Fogle was one of the most recognizable figures in American advertising. Known as the Subway Guy, he became famous in the early 2000s after claiming that his dramatic weight loss was the result of eating Subway sandwiches as part of a healthier lifestyle. The fast food chain embraced his story, and soon Fogle was starring in hundreds of commercials, appearing on talk shows, and visiting schools to promote wellness and good eating habits. To the public, he seemed harmless, even inspirational, an ordinary man who turned his life around and used his story to motivate others. But in 2015, that carefully crafted image collapsed in one of the most stunning downfalls of a television personality. when federal prosecutors revealed shocking crimes that would end his career and send him to prison for more than 15 years. The unraveling of Jared Fogle's public life began with an investigation into a close associate, Russell Taylor, who had been working for the Jared Foundation, a charity Fogle founded to combat childhood obesity. In 2015, Taylor was arrested on charges related to exploitation, and investigators soon discovered disturbing links between him and Fogle. Federal authorities raided Fogle's home in July of that year, seizing computers and electronic devices. For a man who had once been the face of a global fast food brand, images of him in handcuffs were almost unthinkable. What investigators found was damning. Prosecutors revealed that Fogle had been receiving illegal material through Taylor and had also traveled across state lines for encounters with underage individuals. The charges were serious, and the case drew international media attention, not only because of the crimes themselves, but also because of the enormous contrast between his public persona and his private actions. In August 2015, Fogle agreed to a plea deal with federal prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to 2 major charges: distribution and receipt of child pornography, and traveling to engage in unlawful conduct with minors. As part of the agreement, he admitted to having knowingly received illegal videos from Taylor and to having paid for inappropriate encounters with underage victims. His guilty plea stunned the public. The same man who had spent years visiting schools and appearing in family-friendly commercials was now exposed as someone who had secretly engaged in criminal behavior. The sentencing hearing in November 2015 was a dramatic moment. Prosecutors asked for a long sentence, pointing to the seriousness of the crimes and the number of victims impacted by both the material and his actions. Fogle's attorneys argued for leniency, citing his cooperation and his admission of guilt. In the end, the judge sided firmly with the government's position. Jared Fogle was sentenced to 15 years and 8 months in federal prison, fined $175,000, and ordered to pay restitution to victims. He was also placed under lifetime supervised release, meaning that even after serving his prison term, he will remain closely monitored by the justice system. Fogle, who was in his late 30s at the time of sentencing, began his prison term at FC1 Englewood in Colorado. Reports over the years have indicated that his time behind bars has not been easy, as his notoriety made him a high-profile inmate. Today, in his late 40s, he remains incarcerated, serving out his sentence with no possibility of early release before 2029. The downfall of Jared Fogle remains one of the most shocking collapses of a television figure in recent memory. For more than a decade, he was an innocuous part of American popular culture, someone whose commercials ran during primetime television and who regularly appeared on daytime talk shows. Parents once encouraged their children to see him as a role model for healthy living. Now his name is permanently associated with crimes that stand in stark opposition to the values he claimed to represent. For Subway, the scandal was catastrophic. The brand immediately severed all ties with Fogle in 2015, removing any trace of his image from its marketing and distancing itself from his once celebrated story. For fans who had grown up seeing him as a familiar face on television, the revelations were a harsh reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The story of Jared Fogle underscores how quickly fame can vanish when personal actions contradict public image. Once a symbol of personal transformation and corporate success, he is now remembered for the crimes that ended his career and destroyed his legacy. What was once a tale of inspiration turned into a cautionary example of how even the most ordinary-seeming figures can fall in extraordinary and devastating ways. Number 8. James Tim Norman. For years, James Timothy appeared on Welcome to Sweetie Pies, a reality series that ran on the Oprah Winfrey Network between 2011 and 2018. The show followed his mother, Robbie Montgomery, and their family-run soul food restaurant in St. Louis. It was a feel-good program built around food, family, and the ups and downs of running a business together. To viewers, Tim seemed like a central figure, a devoted son helping his mother expand the restaurant and keep their family legacy alive. Fans of the show, many of them older OWN viewers, felt like they knew him personally. But behind the scenes, Tim Norman was plotting something unthinkable, the killing of his own nephew. The tragedy began in 2016 when Norman secretly took out a $450,000 life insurance policy on his 20-year-old nephew, Andre Montgomery Jr. The policy named Norman as the sole beneficiary. At the time, Andre was living in St. Louis, and while the family had its share of tensions, no one could have predicted what would happen next. According to prosecutors, Norman orchestrated a plan driven entirely by greed, one that would leave fans of the show stunned and a family forever broken. On March 14, 2016, Norman set the plan into motion. He coordinated with accomplices, including one woman who was paid to lure Andre to a specific location and another man who carried out the fatal act. That evening, Andre was ambushed and lost his life in St. Louis. The violent end of a young man who had also appeared on Welcome to Sweetie Pies shocked those close to him. But for years, the case went unsolved. The investigation that followed was slow and complex. Detectives eventually uncovered Norman's suspicious financial moves and discovered the large life insurance policy he had taken out just months before Andre's death. As more evidence came together, prosecutors began to see the outlines of a murder-for-hire plot. Cell phone records, financial transactions, and testimony from accomplices pointed to Norman as the mastermind. In 2020, 4 years after Andre's death, federal authorities arrested Tim Norman and charged him with conspiracy to commit murder-for-hire and related counts. For fans of the show, the news was almost impossible to believe. The man they had seen joking in the restaurant, working beside his mother, and presenting himself as a businessman trying to honor family traditions, was now accused of arranging the death of his own nephew. The case captured national headlines, not only because of its shocking betrayal, but also because it connected back to a once-beloved television series. The trial began in 2022 in St. Louis Federal Court. Over the course of several weeks, prosecutors laid out their case in detail. They presented evidence that Norman had hired his accomplices, paid thousands of dollars to set the plot in motion, and quickly attempted to cash in on the insurance policy after Andre's death. Witness testimony was damning, with one accomplice admitting to being paid to lure Andre to the fatal scene. Another confirmed Norman's role in directing the plot. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, but the jury was not persuaded. In September 2022, Tim Norman was found guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit murder for hire, conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud, and related charges. The verdict marked the end of his time as a free man and the final unraveling of his public image. In March 2023, Norman was sentenced to life in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the cruelty of arranging a killing for financial gain and noted the lasting impact on the Montgomery family. Robbie Montgomery, who had once shared her kitchen, her family, and her life with television audiences, was now forced to endure the reality that her son was responsible for taking the life of her grandson. The sentencing brought a measure of closure for Andre's loved ones, but it also underscored the devastating cost of Norman's actions. For fans of Welcome to Sweetie Pies, the crime was heartbreaking. What had been a show about food, family, and togetherness had become the backdrop for one of the most shocking betrayals ever linked to reality television. Today, James Tim Norman is serving his life sentence in federal custody. His story stands as a grim reminder that even those who present themselves as family-oriented and loyal on screen can conceal dark and destructive motives off camera. What began as a program meant to celebrate a family business ended with a family tragedy, and the memory of Andre Montgomery Jr. remains at the heart of it. Number 9. Richard Hatch. In the summer of 2000, television audiences were introduced to something entirely new: reality competition on a grand scale. Survivor debuted on CBS and quickly became a cultural phenomenon. Millions tuned in to watch strangers marooned on an island, forced to build alliances, outwit one another, and survive harsh conditions for a chance at $1 million prize. At the center of it all was Richard Hatch, a corporate trainer from Rhode Island. Charismatic, blunt, and unafraid of controversy, he famously wandered the island nude on several occasions. Hatch outmaneuvered his rivals and became the very first winner of Survivor. Overnight, he was one of the most talked about reality TV stars in America. But in the years that followed, his name would become just as associated with courtroom drama and prison cells as it had been with tropical beaches and strategy. Winning Survivor brought Hatch $1 million and international fame, but it also brought financial scrutiny. Not long after the season aired, the IRS began looking into whether Hatch had reported his prize money correctly. By the mid-2000s, prosecutors alleged he had not. In fact, they said Hatch had failed to pay taxes not only on his Survivor winnings, but also on other income streams, including money he earned from radio appearances and rental properties. For a man who had once been applauded for his clever gameplay, the decision to ignore something as straightforward as tax obligations quickly caught up with him. In 2006, Hatch stood trial in federal court. The charges centered on tax evasion and fraud, and the jury was presented with evidence that he had deliberately concealed his earnings. Hatch maintained that he believed CBS or Survivor producers had paid the taxes for him, but the defense didn't hold. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 51 months in prison, just over 4 years. For the very first reality TV winner, it was a spectacular fall. Hatch began serving his sentence at a federal prison in West Virginia, spending about 3 years behind bars before being released in 2009. But his legal troubles didn't end there. As part of his release, he was placed on probation and required to file accurate tax returns and pay the money he still owed. Yet in 2011, he was sent back to prison for 9 months after failing to comply with those conditions. The judge ruled that Hatch had violated the terms of his probation by neither filing updated returns nor making payments. Even after serving that second sentence, Hatch's defiance continued to create problems. In 2011, he appeared on television interviews without the court's permission, a move that once again violated his probation. That earned him yet another brief stint in custody. What began as a straightforward tax case had now spiraled into a cycle of prison time and probation violations, keeping Hatch in the headlines for all the wrong reasons. For fans who remembered him as the strategic mastermind of the very first Survivor, the repeated incarcerations were a disappointment. Hatch had once symbolized the birth of modern reality television, a contestant who understood that personality, manipulation, and boldness could win the game. Instead, his legacy became a cautionary tale about how quickly fame can sour when paired with poor decisions. Despite his setbacks, Hatch has occasionally tried to re-enter the public sphere. He's made appearances on other reality shows, spoken about his time in prison, and continued to insist that he was unfairly treated by the legal system. But the repeated legal issues left a permanent mark. The man who once stood as the face of reality, television's rise, is now remembered just as much for the years he spent fighting the IRS and serving time in federal custody. Richard Hatch's story remains one of the earliest and clearest examples of reality TV fame gone wrong. He went from the triumph of outlasting competitors on a deserted island to the humiliation of standing before judges and serving multiple prison terms. What began as a $1 million victory ended as a reminder that fame without responsibility can unravel in the harshest of ways. Number 10. Teresa Giudice. By the late 2000s, Teresa Giudice had become one of Bravo's most recognizable reality TV stars. A breakout cast member of The Real Housewives of New Jersey, she was known for her fiery personality, explosive arguments, and an unforgettable moment in which she flipped a dinner table in anger, an image that became a pop culture staple. Viewers were equally fascinated by her glamorous lifestyle, from sprawling mansions to designer wardrobes. To many fans, Teresa embodied the larger-than-life drama of the Housewives franchise. But behind the Bravo cameras and the luxury shopping trips, the Giudices were living far beyond their means. Their empire was built not on legitimate wealth, but on years of financial deception that would eventually land both Teresa and her husband, Joe, in federal prison. The couple's troubles came into focus in 2009 when they filed for bankruptcy. At the time, they claimed more than $10 million in debt, even as they continued to showcase a lifestyle filled with expensive cars, lavish parties, and real estate. Federal investigators soon began to suspect that the Giudices weren't just mismanaging money. They were concealing assets and falsifying documents. Over the next several years, prosecutors uncovered evidence of bankruptcy fraud, mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. According to court filings, the Giudices had inflated their income on loan applications, hidden assets during their bankruptcy case, and failed to pay taxes on hundreds of thousands of dollars of earnings. In July 2013, Teresa and Joe were indicted on 39 federal counts. The news shocked fans who had watched them on Bravo for years, turning them into household names. The charges revealed a pattern of deception stretching back nearly a decade. At first, the couple pleaded not guilty, but as the weight of the evidence mounted, they agreed to a plea deal the following year. In March 2014, they admitted guilt to multiple counts of fraud. Teresa pleaded guilty to 4 charges, while Joe pleaded guilty to 5, including failing to file tax returns. The sentencing that fall was a dramatic and widely publicized moment. In October 2014, a federal judge sentenced Teresa Giudice to 15 months in federal prison, while Joe received a far longer sentence of 41 months. Because they had 4 young daughters, the judge allowed Teresa to serve her term first, so that Joe could remain at home with the children until she returned. The ruling underscored the seriousness of their crimes, but it also provided a glimpse into the devastating impact their choices had on their family. In January 2015, Teresa reported to the Federal Correctional Institution in Danbury, Connecticut, the same prison that inspired the setting for Orange is the New Black. For fans accustomed to seeing her in designer gowns on Bravo, images of Teresa in a prison uniform were surreal. She served nearly a year before being released in December 2015. Joe then began his sentence in March 2016, serving 3.5 years before his release in 2019. But his punishment did not end there. As a non-citizen, Joe was ordered deported to his native Italy after completing his term, a ruling that separated him from his family in New Jersey and added another layer of tragedy to the saga. The Giudices' convictions became one of the most talked about scandals in the history of the Real Housewives franchise. What had seemed like a storyline of wealth and drama turned into a real-life example of financial crime and its consequences. For Bravo viewers, it was astonishing to see a celebrity so associated with glitz and glamour suddenly facing the stark realities of federal prison. Since her release, Teresa has returned to reality television, rejoining the Real Housewives of New Jersey and continuing to build her career in entertainment. She has spoken publicly about her time behind bars, describing it as life-changing, and has attempted to rebrand herself as stronger and more grounded. Yet the memory of her prison sentence and the fraud that caused it remains a permanent part of her story. The case of Teresa and Joe Giudice prove that reality TV fame offers no protection from the law. Their downfall underscored that financial crimes, no matter who commits them, carry real consequences. For fans, it was a dramatic reminder that behind the designer labels and on-screen drama, the reality of the Giudices' life was far darker than the show ever revealed.